When I saw the letter, I felt my father's voice leave the room with him. I remember the exact moment, sitting on the faded green armchair in my father's study, the smell of old mahogany and faint pipe smoke still lingering, the morning sun catching the dust motes like tiny floating stars. The envelope in my hands was heavier than I expected. I had opened it without thinking, and then the words hit me like a cold, unyielding wind. My father, the man who had been my anchor in the world, had been gone for just over a month, and now it felt as if he was trying to erase me, or worse, that someone else was trying to. It was my stepmother, Helen, always poised, always smiling in a way that didn't quite reach her eyes. A woman who, I had once believed, genuinely loved my father. But this letter suggested otherwise. The words on the page were clear, meticulous, legalistic, my name conspicuously absent from the final version of my father's will. My inheritance, the home where I had grown up, the memories of birthdays, laughter echoing in the hallway, every late-night conversation at the kitchen table, all stripped away as if I had never existed. My hands shook, and for a moment, I didn't breathe. I thought I could hear my father's voice in my mind, gentle and steady, telling me to be patient, to be strong. But even that voice seemed muffled, drowned out by the raw ache in my chest. I pushed the envelope to the side, my fingers grazing the polished surface of his desk. His glasses still sat there, half smudged, like he had just stepped out for a moment. I imagined him laughing softly, telling me some terrible pun he thought was funny. And then the reality hit me. He wasn't coming back. The house was quiet, the kind of quiet that presses against your ears, and I realized how alone I felt. I wanted to scream, to throw something against the wall, but the tightness in my throat kept me silent. I wanted answers, but I didn't know where to begin. Before my father passed, life had been ordinary, in that comforting way that makes you forget how fragile it is. I was 28, living in the house with him while I figured out my own life, a blend of work, weekend brunches with friends, and late-night talks that always ended with him saying, "You're stronger than you think, kiddo." He had remarried 10 years ago. After my mother died, and for a long time, Helen seemed harmless enough. She was meticulous about the house, kept the garden neat, cooked meals that smelled faintly of basil and rosemary, and never complained about my presence. She even invited me to family dinners, and for a while I thought maybe we could all be a real family again. My father, God bless him, had always been a man of principle. He would argue for hours about ethics, fairness, and honesty. But Helen, she had a subtle charm that could twist those principles like clay. I hadn't seen it then, not really. I only noticed a few offhand comments here or there, little digs masked as jokes. "You're always in such a rush," or "Don't you think you should focus more on your career than other things?" Those moments didn't matter to me at first. I was busy with life, working as a graphic designer, trying to carve out a small corner of independence while still leaning on my father for support. Weekends were for laughter, evenings for quiet talks over coffee. The scent of toast and sugar filling the kitchen while we debated everything from politics to which movie deserved an Oscar. That was my life. Simple. Familiar, safe. And then, as the weeks before his death went by, subtle changes began to creep in. I remember the first time I felt something was off. I had walked into the kitchen early one Saturday morning. The smell of pancakes was in the air, but my father wasn't there. Instead, Helen was at the stove, flipping a pancake with deliberate care. "Morning," I said, expecting a smile. "Morning," she replied, and her tone was polite, neutral, like the warmth had been drained from the word. I shrugged it off, thinking she might have just woken up. But then I noticed it, the way she moved, the careful way she placed the plates, as if she was performing for someone invisible. And the small glance at me, sharp and calculating. I felt a tiny, cold spike of unease, but I ignored it. A week later, I overheard a phone conversation. I was folding laundry, headphones in, pretending not to notice, but Helen's voice carried from the kitchen. "Yes. Yes, he trusts me completely. Don't worry about her. She won't get anything if I can help it. My blood ran cold. I froze midfold. My hands shook as I dropped the laundry basket. I wanted to confront her immediately, but something inside me, maybe the memory of my father's words about patience and strategy, made me stop. I didn't speak, didn't even breathe too loudly. I just listened, and just like that, the first seed of suspicion was planted. I tried to push it away, tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Maybe she was talking about bills or a family surprise I didn't know about. But the doubt lingered, subtle yet persistent, like the faint ticking of a clock in a silent room. Days later, the funeral. A solemn day, flowers piled high in the chapel, the air thick with perfume and quiet whispers. People I barely knew offered condolences. Helen stood by my side, perfectly composed, her hand resting lightly on my arm, smiling that same controlled smile. Inside, I wanted to scream. I wanted to grab the nearest person and tell them what I'd heard, what I suspected. But the grief, heavy and suffocating, kept my mouth shut. I felt trapped inside my own body, a witness to the world moving around me while my heart cracked in silence. After the ceremony, she spoke to me quietly, her tone almost tender. "You'll understand when you're older," she said. "Your father, he wanted to protect everyone." I nodded, swallowing down the bitter taste rising in my throat. But I didn't understand. Not yet. The first clue, the tiny crack in the world I thought was solid, came not in words but in actions. Bills started to arrive in my name that I hadn't authorized, letters from lawyers with her signature, appointments I didn't make. And then the envelope, sealed, official, and devastating. I stared at it for hours, tracing the edges with my finger. Each word felt like a betrayal, each line a final reminder that the life I had known was slipping through my fingers. And yet, deep inside, beneath the layers of shock and heartbreak, a spark of something else emerged. Not vengeance, not yet, but determination. I wasn't going to be erased. My father's love, the years we spent together, the memories embedded in every corner of that house. They couldn't be written out of existence. Something inside me shifted, quiet and resolute. I didn't know how yet, but I knew this. I would fight. Not for greed, not for revenge, but for recognition, for justice, for the right to remember my father the way he had wanted to be remembered. And that was where it began. The days after the funeral were a strange blur. I moved through the house like a ghost, touching familiar surfaces, inhaling the scent of my father's old cologne, lingering in his study, and trying to convince myself that this nightmare could somehow be undone. But the more I lingered, the more the reality of Helen's intentions settled in like a winter frost. She was meticulous, careful, and utterly deliberate. Every gesture, every smile, every word now carried the weight of calculation. I started noticing little things I had missed before. The way she'd rearranged the photo frames, subtly moving pictures of me out of the line of sight. The way she would answer the phone quietly in the study, lowering her voice whenever I passed by. Even the garden, which I once loved to tend with my father, seemed different. Pruned, controlled, sterile. A garden without life. I tried to convince myself I was imagining it, that grief was twisting reality. But the nagging suspicion refused to fade. I began to pay closer attention, writing things down in a small notebook, dates, odd behaviors, comments she had made in passing. It felt obsessive at first, but it was the only thing keeping me from completely losing my mind. One afternoon, as I sorted through old letters in my father's desk, I found a small envelope tucked between the pages of a ledger. It wasn't sealed, and the handwriting was unmistakable, my father's. Inside was a note, brief but telling. If anything ever happens to me, remember that love does not always mean trust. Protect what is yours, but always with dignity. I read it over and over, feeling both a sting and a comfort. He had known. He had always known that someone might try to rewrite the story he had built. And now it was my turn to honor that trust. The first real confrontation came unexpectedly. I had been at the local bank, trying to understand some of the legal documents Helen had started filing under my father's name. While I was reviewing a stack of papers, she appeared, calm as ever, her heels clicking softly against the tile floor. "I thought I'd find you here," she said, her tone casual but with a hint of challenge. I looked up at her, my stomach knotting. "Helen," I said quietly, "we need to talk." She raised an eyebrow, leaning against the counter. "About what?" "About the will. About my father's wishes." She laughed softly, a delicate, polished sound. "Your father's wishes? I'm doing what he wanted, you just don't understand." Her words were smooth, but I saw the flicker in her eyes, the momentary betrayal that gave her away. I had been taught to read people the way my father had, to notice the subtlest cues. And Helen, for all her composure, couldn't hide the truth. "I understand perfectly," I said, my voice low but steady, "and I won't let you erase me from his life, or his legacy." Her smile tightened, and for the first time, I sensed real fear. She collected her papers and left with a graceful nod, but I knew the game had begun. I started investigating quietly, seeking legal counsel and gathering proof. Every day I felt the tension between us growing, like a taut wire ready to snap. I learned how the will had been altered after my father's death, how signatures had been manipulated, and how she had systematically tried to remove my name from every document connected to his estate. I spent nights reading through emails, bank statements, and old letters tracing her actions carefully. I became a detective in my own life, driven not by vengeance but by the quiet fire of justice. It wasn't easy. Each discovery brought with it a wave of anger, grief, and disbelief. But with every piece of evidence, I felt stronger. I wasn't just fighting for money or property. I was fighting to reclaim the truth of my father's life and his love for me. One evening, I found myself back in my father's study, holding a faded photograph of the three of us. Him, Helen, and me taken years ago at a summer barbecue. The memory hit me like a wave. The smell of grilled corn, my father's booming laugh, Helen pretending to laugh along with us while her eyes darted elsewhere. I realized then that her charm had always been a mask. Beneath it, she had ambitions that didn't include me. I sat there for hours, feeling the grief and anger coiling tightly in my chest. But beneath all that, there was clarity. I understood something vital. I had to act not out of spite, but out of integrity. My father's name deserved respect. My place in his life deserved recognition. And Helen had underestimated me. It was in those quiet hours, under the fading sunlight and the ticking of the clock, that I formulated my plan. Not a reckless emotional plan, but a deliberate, patient one. I would gather every piece of evidence, every witness, every letter my father had written, every bank statement and legal notice. I would construct a case so undeniable, so meticulous, that even Helen couldn't deny the truth. The weeks that followed were a slow burn. I met with lawyers, traced financial records, and slowly built a network of support from relatives and family friends who had always known my father's true intentions. Every conversation was a careful dance, revealing just enough to get help, keeping just enough back to avoid alerting Helen. During that time, I also reflected on my relationship with my father. I remembered his stories of justice and fairness, his lessons on strength and patience, and the way he had always said that real power was in maintaining dignity, even when you were hurt. Those memories became my armor. Helen, of course, continued her quiet maneuvers. Invitations to family events that excluded me, casual comments about my absence, subtle manipulations meant to isolate me. But I refused to be baited. Every time I felt anger bubbling up, I remembered the note my father had left me. Dignity, patience, strength. It was exhausting. Mentally, emotionally, and physically, but each day I felt a little more in control. I wasn't powerless anymore. I was learning to wield my father's lessons as a shield, turning grief into determination. And then, finally, I found the missing piece, a series of emails between Helen and the estate attorney that confirmed her attempts to remove me from the will entirely. It was small, almost hidden but unmistakable. Holding that printout in my hands, I felt something shift. The path forward was no longer uncertain. The next step would be confrontation, but this time it would be on my terms. I never expected confrontation to feel so quiet. Not the angry shouting kind you see in movies, but a slow, deliberate reckoning. I had waited, prepared, and gathered everything. Emails, bank statements, notarized letters, witness accounts. Every piece of evidence built a chain that led straight to Helen's deceit. And now, as I walked up the familiar hallway toward her office in the house, I felt the tension press against my chest like a heavy weight. "Helen," I said, my voice calm but firm. "We need to talk, now." She looked up from her computer, her expression carefully neutral, but I caught it. The micro-expression of irritation, of fear, of recognition that her control was slipping. "What about?" she asked, her voice silky. I didn't waste time. I placed the stack of documents on her desk, each paper a testament to her manipulation. "About my father. About what you've been doing since he passed. About the will." Her eyes flicked to the top document, then darted away. She took a breath, like she was about to spin a story, but I had anticipated that. I leaned slightly closer, letting my presence fill the room. "I know about the emails. I know about the changes you tried to make. I know you tried to erase me from his life, even after he was gone." For a moment, she said nothing. She looked at me, and I could see her carefully crafting a response. But it was too late. I had the evidence. I had the truth. I didn't think you would find out, she murmured finally, her tone almost pleading. "Didn't think I would?" I repeated, my voice rising slightly with disbelief. "Helen, you were willing to rewrite my father's life to fit your ambitions. My father trusted you. And you," I gestured toward the papers, "you betrayed him, and me, in the worst way possible." She opened her mouth to reply, then paused, her eyes darting around the office. I saw the calculation, the momentary panic. She realized I wasn't just confronting her. I was holding her accountable. I took a deep breath, letting the anger settle into something colder, sharper. "I'm not asking for apologies. I'm not negotiating. What you did, it has consequences. And the first step is making sure my father's intentions are honored." Her lips pressed together tightly. Then slowly, deliberately, she leaned back and said, "And what if I refuse?" I didn't flinch. "Then the law will enforce them. And so will the family. You may have tried to isolate me, but you underestimated the people who knew my father best." Her composure cracked just a little. She picked up a pen and tapped it against the desk nervously, something I had never seen before. That hesitation told me everything. The confrontation didn't end in shouting or tears. It ended in silence. Loaded, pregnant silence that carried more weight than any raised voice could. I didn't gloat. I didn't scream. I simply presented the truth and let it sit between us, undeniable and inescapable. After what felt like hours, she finally spoke. I was trying to protect myself. I didn't want to be left with nothing." Her words were almost human, almost remorseful, but they lacked accountability. I wanted to respond, to tell her that protecting herself didn't give her the right to erase someone else's life. But I didn't. Instead, I let my eyes convey what I couldn't say in words. "I see you, and I will not be ignored." The next weeks were a careful negotiation, guided by lawyers and supported by relatives who had always loved my father. Helen tried to argue, tried to minimize, but every claim she made was countered by the evidence I had meticulously gathered. Emails, letters, financial statements, every one a thread tying her to the truth. And finally, the breakthrough came. During a private family meeting with the estate attorney present, Helen was forced to acknowledge her actions. She tried to justify, to explain, to soften, but the facts were irrefutable. The documents were signed, the original intent of my father's will restored, and for the first time since his passing, I felt a measure of justice settle over me. But the confrontation left scars. Not on the surface, not physically, but deep in the trust and in the heart. I had loved my father, and I had loved Helen in a way, Once, years ago, when I believed in her sincerity. That betrayal cut sharply. And even as justice was served, I realized that part of me would always carry the memory of that moment. The knowing smile. The casual cruelty hidden behind charm. Yet, there was also an unexpected lesson in all of it. Strength isn't loud. Strength is quiet. Strength is knowing your worth and refusing to let others redefine it. It's patience, diligence, and courage in the face of someone who would try to erase you. After the legal battle concluded, Helen left the house under a cloud of humiliation. She tried to maintain her dignity in public, but anyone who had seen the family meeting knew the truth. The community, the relatives, even some friends who had been distant now whispered about the betrayal. But I didn't rejoice. I didn't feel victorious in a petty way. I felt relief. I felt the weight of my father's love restored, honored, and defended. In the quiet that followed, I walked through the house, touching the surfaces that had once belonged solely to my father. The study, the garden, the kitchen. I let my hands linger on every memory, every echo of laughter, every whisper of advice he had given me. And I understood fully that this fight was never just about inheritance. It was about recognition, about keeping the truth alive, about honoring the life of a man who had given me everything. That night, I sat in my father's favorite chair, holding his note close. The fire in the hearth flickered softly, casting shadows across the room. I felt a strange mixture of exhaustion, grief, and quiet triumph. The house felt like home again, not just a physical space, but a sanctuary of memory and love that no one could erase. And for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to breathe fully, to let go of the constant tension that had gripped me. I realized that my father's wisdom had guided me all along. I hadn't needed to fight to spite Helen. I had needed to fight to protect the truth, and in doing so, I had protected myself. Justice doesn't always arrive with applause. Sometimes it settles over you like a soft blanket after a long winter, quiet, steady, almost surprising in its gentleness. In the days after the legal settlement, the house seemed to sigh in relief. Dust danced lazily in the afternoon sun. The wood floors, once echoing with uncertainty, felt grounded again under my feet. And I could finally move without feeling like someone was watching me, waiting to erase my every step. But while peace returned to my home, outside those walls, truth was still spreading, like a ripple across still water. People talked. They always do, not out of malice, but because truth has a way of traveling on the wind. Little whispers carried through grocery store aisles, hushed conversations in church pews, curious glances at the cafe where I'd sit with a cup of tea and stare out at the town I'd always known. They didn't pity me. That was the surprising part. There was respect in their eyes, gentle nods of solidarity. Some offered quiet support. A few older neighbors who'd known my father for decades stopped by with casseroles and stories, because that's how some people offer love without saying the word. She was a pretty woman. Mrs. Harrington, our next-door neighbor, murmured one afternoon while stirring sugar into her tea at my kitchen table. Pretty can be dangerous when it hides ambition without conscience. I didn't respond right away. Instead, I watched the steam rise from my cup, curling into soft shapes like prayers whispered to heaven. She loved him, I finally said, though I wasn't sure if I believed it anymore. Just not the way he needed to be loved. Mrs. Harrington studied me with the knowing eyes only elders possess. Your father saw goodness in everyone. It's a blessing, and sometimes a heartbreak. Her words stayed with me long after she left. Of course, the truth didn't just drift through whispers. It found its way into the community in more pointed ways. At church, I noticed the shift. Helen rarely attended services after my father passed, but when she did, she carried herself differently. Chin high, shoulders stiff, eyes scanning the room like she was daring someone to speak first. No one confronted her. This town wasn't built on confrontation, but the space around her seemed to grow, a silent circle no one stepped into. Not cruelty, just consequence. And yet I didn't hate her. Anger had flickered in me many times, sharp and bright. But hate? Hate is a poison, and I refused to swallow it. I saw her for what she was. A woman terrified of losing stability, clinging so desperately that she lost her integrity in the process. There's a sadness in that, a tragedy she crafted with her own hands. The attorney, Mr. Langley, called a week after the settlement to tie up final paperwork. His voice was measured as always. "You handled this with more grace than most would have," he said. I didn't feel graceful, I replied truthfully. I felt tired, and angry, and sad. "That's what grace is," he said gently. "Doing what's right even when your heart is breaking." After we hung up, I sat by the window again, watching autumn leaves fall like slow golden confessions. Life was settling into a new shape, one without my father's physical presence, but filled with his memory in every corner. The public consequence didn't end with whispers or social distance. It arrived unexpectedly in the form of an invitation, community foundation dinner, honoring local legacy. The moment I saw the card, my breath caught. It wasn't a typical invitation. It was addressed to me, not to the household, and the note scribbled inside by the committee chair read, "Your father left a mark here. We'd like to honor his legacy with you." Helen's name wasn't mentioned. Not once. I sat quietly holding the card, tracing the embossed letters with my thumb. It was a bittersweet honor, one I wished my father was still here to attend beside me. But as I stood in front of my bedroom mirror the evening of the event, smoothing the fabric of my simple black dress, I felt a strange calm settle over me. I didn't need to be glamorous. I didn't need to announce anything. Just being present was enough. When I arrived, heads turned, not in shock, but in warmth. Old friends of my father's approached with gentle smiles, firm handshakes, stories that made my heart ache and fill all at once. "I remember when he donated books to the school," one retired teacher said, her eyes misty, quietly, never asked for recognition. "That was him," I whispered. People clinked glasses, shared laughter. I stood by a framed photo of him, smiling in that unguarded, full-heart way he always had, and felt tears prick the backs of my eyes. Then someone touched my elbow lightly. I turned to find Helen standing there. Her once pristine poise looked frayed around the edges. Her smile, a thin, trembling line. "I didn't expect to see you here," she murmured. I offered a gentle nod. "It's a celebration of his life." "I wouldn't miss it," she swallowed hard, eyes darting toward the photo. "He loved you," she whispered, voice cracking. "I know," I replied softly. A beat of silence passed, heavy, honest. "I'm sorry," she said then. Truly said, no polish, no performance, just a quiet confession. I drew a breath, feeling years of emotion move through me like a tide. "I hope you find peace," I said. It wasn't forgiveness, not fully, but it was a bridge. A mercy my father would have offered, even to someone who had hurt him. She blinked, nodded once, and stepped away. As I watched her walk into the dim foyer, I realized that consequences don't always look like punishment. Sometimes they look like solitude, reflection, the weight of one's own choices settling in the silence. That night, I returned home, slipped out of my shoes, and walked barefoot through the house. Moonlight poured through the windows, bathing the familiar rooms in silver. I paused in the study, resting my hand on my father's old chair. "I did it," I whispered. I protected what mattered. And in the quiet, I felt it. Not a voice, not a sign, but a warmth. A sense of rightness, as though he was there, sitting with me, proud. And I knew the public chapter of this story had closed. The healing one was just beginning. The first morning after the final settlement, I woke to sunlight spilling through the curtains, painting the walls in gold. The house was quiet in a way that felt like permission to breathe again. I sat on the edge of my father's bed for a long time, listening to the distant hum of the city outside, the occasional bird tapping on the windowsill. The smell of damp earth from the garden drifted in through the slightly open window. carrying with it the faint hint of roses my father had planted years ago. I had always loved mornings like this, but lately they had been heavy with tension. Every creak of the floorboards, every shuffle of papers felt loaded, as if the walls themselves were whispering secrets. But today they were just walls, silent witnesses. I made my way to the kitchen, barefoot, letting my feet feel the worn wood beneath them. The aroma of fresh coffee greeted me, and I poured a cup, savoring the warmth between my hands. I sat by the kitchen table, staring at the steam curling into the sunlight, thinking of my father, of how proud he would have been to see the truth restored, to see the life we had fought for still intact. I reached for my journal, the one I had started keeping after his passing. Flipping through the pages, I saw entries filled with grief, anger, suspicion, and determination. Each word captured a moment of struggle, but now, reading them, I could see a thread of growth woven through the pain. I had learned patience, resilience, and a strength I didn't know I possessed. Later that morning, I walked through the garden. The roses, which had once been slightly overgrown and neglected, now felt like a living testament to endurance. I knelt and pruned a bush, each careful snip a small act of reclamation. The soil smelled damp, rich, alive, and I felt a strange kinship with it. Just like the garden, I too had been neglected, tested, and almost erased. But here I was, rooted and growing. I thought about Helen. I couldn't hate her, not entirely. Her choices had hurt me, yes, and they had betrayed my father's trust. But underneath it all, there was fear driving her actions. Fear of being alone, fear of losing status, fear of vulnerability. And in that fear, she had made a choice I would never have made, a choice to value ambition over love and integrity. I allowed myself a quiet acknowledgement of her humanity. Not forgiveness yet, not fully, but recognition that she was flawed as we all are. And that awareness allowed me to release some of the tension that had been coiled in my chest for weeks. Over the next few weeks, I slowly rebuilt my routines. I started with small things. Cooking breakfast just the way my father liked it, setting the table for one, and sipping coffee while reading through old letters he had written to me over the years. Each letter felt like a conversation across time, and I read them aloud sometimes, letting his voice fill the empty spaces of the house. I reconnected with friends who had been supportive but distant during the chaos. We took long walks in the park, talking about everything and nothing. Their laughter reminded me of the lighter parts of life, the parts I had almost forgotten amidst legal documents and betrayals. One friend, Mara, even joked about me turning into a detective during those weeks of investigation, and I laughed, a sound I hadn't made in a long time. I also reached out to distant relatives. Some I hadn't seen in years. There was awkwardness at first, questions about Helen and the will, and quiet expressions of support. But over time, these connections strengthened, reminding me that family isn't just blood, it's trust, shared history, and love that withstands conflict. I dedicated part of my healing to honoring my father's legacy. I started volunteering at the library he had loved, helping organize donations and reading programs for children. The smell of old books, the quiet rustle of pages, and the excited chatter of young readers became a balm to my spirit. Each act, small as it was, felt like a continuation of his life through me. I also began contributing to a local scholarship fund he had helped establish years ago. Sitting in the office of the foundation, reviewing applications and imagining the futures of these young people, I felt a sense of purpose. My grief and struggle had transformed into something that could nurture hope in others. And then there were moments of reflection. Long, quiet moments where I would sit in my father's study, hands on his old desk, looking at the framed photos on the wall. There was the photo of our family at the beach, his arm around me, my mother smiling in the background. There was another, at my college graduation, his pride shining from every line of his face. In these moments, I felt his presence, not as a ghost, but as a quiet, guiding force. His lessons, his love, and his trust were embedded in me. And I understood something vital. This wasn't just about inheritance, justice, or proving Helen wrong. It was about carrying forward the values he had instilled in me: integrity, patience, courage, love. The quiet power of these moments was humbling. I realized that healing wasn't a dramatic scene of catharsis. It was a slow, deliberate process of reclaiming my life, one act, one thought, one memory at a time. By the time autumn fully set in, the house had transformed along with me. The garden bloomed with roses and late-season flowers. The kitchen smelled of fresh bread and roasted coffee beans, and the living room echoed with laughter during evening calls with friends and relatives. I allowed myself to think about the future again, the possibility of love, of adventure, of new beginnings. I knew Helen's absence would leave occasional pangs, news that she moved on, casual mentions from mutual acquaintances, but those pangs no longer held power over me. I had established boundaries, reclaimed my space, and solidified my sense of self. I started keeping a daily ritual: morning coffee in the study, a short walk in the garden, reading letters and journals, and then time to plan projects that mattered to me. It wasn't about revenge anymore. It was about life, about memory, and about honoring my father in ways that brought joy, not pain. And in that routine, I found peace. The fight had been exhausting, both mentally and emotionally. But the lessons were invaluable: the importance of standing up for yourself, the power of evidence and patience, and the quiet strength of dignity. I hadn't just won back my father's legacy. I had rediscovered myself. And in the quiet of the study, surrounded by the scent of old paper, "Roses and sunlight," I whispered. "Thank you, Dad." I kept my promise. The nights became my favorite part of the day. After long hours tending the garden, sorting letters, or meeting with friends and family, I would retreat to my father's study. The moonlight poured through the tall windows, casting silver shadows on the wooden floors. The faint scent of old books mingled with the lingering aroma of the roses from the garden outside. In that quiet, I could finally think without the weight of tension pressing against my chest. I often sat in my father's chair, the leather worn smooth from years of use, and let my mind wander over the events that had consumed the past months. The grief of losing him had been sharp, like jagged glass embedded in my chest, but the betrayal had cut even deeper. For weeks I had been swimming in a sea of doubt, mistrust, and anger, feeling like every corner of the house carried a silent accusation. Now, though I felt something I hadn't allowed myself to feel in months: clarity. Not just about Helen, but about myself, about my father's lessons, about the life I wanted to build in his absence. I reflected on the small acts that had carried me through: holding a cup of coffee while watching the steam curl into sunlight, kneeling in the garden to prune a rose bush, reading letters from my father that smelled faintly of ink and memory. Each one was a thread tying me back to my strength, a quiet reminder that I had survived, not only the loss of my father, but the attempt to erase me from his life. I thought about Helen, about the way she had smiled, so carefully constructed, hiding the ambition and fear beneath, about the confrontation where I laid every piece of evidence before her, and she had faltered for the first time in our lives together. About the community's subtle, quiet response, how people had observed, whispered, and eventually recognized the truth without cruelty or spectacle. I realized that consequences don't always appear as punishment. Sometimes they appear as reflection, isolation, and the slow, heavy weight of knowing that one's choices have been seen and judged, not by judges in robes, but by the world that once quietly admired them. Helen's absence from our lives was itself a consequence. The loss of trust, the social subtlety of whispers, the recognition that her actions would not go unnoticed, they were the justice that life often metes out quietly, without fanfare. And yet, the story wasn't just about justice. It was about healing, about reclaiming what had been threatened but never truly lost. I began reconnecting more deeply with people who had supported my father, and in turn, supported me. Friends and relatives offered companionship, guidance, and the comfort of shared memory. We laughed, sometimes shyly at first, sometimes with the abandon that comes when grief has finally loosened its grip. I poured energy into continuing my father's legacy. I volunteered at the library he had loved, organizing reading programs, helping children discover the joy of literature. I contributed to scholarship funds he had supported, ensuring young people could access education and opportunity. Each act, however small, became a balm. Each was a reminder that even in the aftermath of betrayal and loss, one could create meaning and carry forward love. I also began reflecting more on the lessons my father had tried to teach me all along. Strength is quiet. Integrity is patient. Courage is measured. Love is both a shield and a guiding light. And perhaps most importantly, dignity is something no one can take from you unless you allow it. I thought about the moments of temptation, to respond in anger, to gloat, to let vengeance guide me. I realized that I had resisted those impulses. My fight had not been for revenge. It had been for truth, for honor, for the preservation of love and memory. And in resisting anger, I had found freedom. The house, once heavy with tension and suspicion, became a sanctuary again. I could walk through the rooms and touch familiar surfaces without flinching. The study smelled faintly of ink and dust. The kitchen carried the comforting aroma of bread and coffee, and the garden bloomed in late-season glory. Even the furniture seemed to sigh in relief, as if it, too, were conscious of the restoration that had taken place. At night, I would sometimes imagine my father beside me, smiling that wide, unguarded smile he had always reserved for moments of quiet triumph. I would whisper my thoughts to him, about the people I had reconnected with, the garden I had restored, the scholarship I had helped fund. I would tell him about the strength I had discovered in myself. And though I knew he could not respond, the warmth in my chest told me he understood, that he was proud, that he had been there all along, guiding me through grief and betrayal toward the life he had always believed I deserved. Even Helen occasionally crossed my mind, not with rage, not with longing, but with reflection. She had made choices just as I had. And though her path had led to isolation and quiet consequences, I understood that resentment would only trap me in the past. I chose instead to carry compassion alongside my resolve, recognizing human flaws without allowing them to define me. In this space, I began imagining the future again. Opportunities for work that excited me, travel to places I had only dreamed of, new friendships, and perhaps one day, love again. I allowed myself to believe in possibility, to trust in life's rhythm, and to carry forward the principles my father had instilled in me. So I share this story with you not to boast, not to relive the pain, but to remind you, there is power in standing firm, in protecting the truth, in reclaiming what is rightfully yours. Even in the most painful betrayals, even when someone tries to erase your presence, your memory, or your legacy, you can emerge whole. You can transform grief into purpose, betrayal into clarity, and fear into strength. And as you read this, I ask you to reflect on your own life. What would you do if someone tried to rewrite your story? How far would you go to protect your memory, your integrity, and your rightful place in the world? The quiet victories, the ones where dignity, patience, and courage guide your steps, are the ones that last the longest. They are the ones that honor the people we love, the lives we live, and the principles we hold dear. Would you have had the courage to stand your ground, to reclaim what was taken, to preserve truth and honor in the face of betrayal? I invite you to share your thoughts in the comments. And if this story resonated with you, if it reminded you of the quiet battles and triumphs in your own life, please subscribe and follow along. Because sometimes the stories we live, the choices we make, and the truths we uncover are the ones that teach us who we really are. Even after months of quiet restoration, there were still mornings when grief would sneak up like mist across the garden. I'd wake to the distant hum of traffic, birds chirping in rhythm with the first rays of sunlight, and the faint smell of dew on roses, and for a moment, I would forget. Then the memory of my father's absence would press softly, insistently against my chest. I began to notice how much of my life had been tied to him, not just in daily routines, but but in values, gestures, and little unspoken lessons. I remembered waking up early as a child and finding him already at the kitchen table, reading newspapers and sipping coffee while the whole house was still asleep. I would crawl onto his lap, barely awake, and he would ruffle my hair with that gentle smile, murmuring, "The world is big, but don't be afraid to make your mark." Those words carried me through every challenge, though I hadn't realized it until now. The house itself seemed to breathe differently in the absence of Helen's tension. Morning light pooled in the corners of rooms that had once felt charged with suspicion. Dust motes drifted lazily in the beams like tiny reminders of the life that had persisted through all the chaos. I began to notice the small things again. The way the wooden floors creaked differently in the winter, the faint smell of aged books in the study, the delicate rustle of the oak tree leaves against the windows at night. Each sound, scent, and gesture became a thread tying me to my father's legacy. I also revisited old memories, both joyful and difficult. Childhood vacations, the warmth of my father's hand guiding me through a crowded street fair, the smell of rain-soaked asphalt on summer afternoons, the quiet afternoons when he read aloud to me and my younger sibling. Each memory was more than nostalgia. It was a map of values, of trust, of integrity. I realized that my fight with Helen had not only been about a will, but about safeguarding these values from being rewritten or erased. And Helen, I found myself reflecting more deeply on her motivations. At times, I imagined her alone in some room, replaying her choices, feeling the weight of the truth she had tried to hide. Was she aware of the emotional destruction she had caused? Did she feel the loss of dignity, the isolation, the community's subtle judgment? I didn't know for certain, and perhaps I never would, but I understood that anger alone was insufficient. It would only chain me to the past. I needed a deeper understanding of human flaws to truly move forward. The community's response, subtle yet profound, reinforced this perspective. Neighbors who had once been merely acquaintances now smiled warmly, shared memories of my father, and offered quiet affirmations of solidarity. At the local market, I was greeted by friends I hadn't seen in years, and I realized that truth has a way of emerging, even without spectacle. It doesn't require triumphal displays. It requires patience, evidence, and integrity. I also reestablished bonds with family, cousins who had been distant, aunts and uncles who had remained silent during the dispute, now reached out in support. I hosted small gatherings at the house, simple dinners, afternoon teas, and even quiet storytelling sessions in the study, where we shared family memories that honored my father's life. The house, once a place of tension and whispered conspiracies, became a sanctuary for connection. The walls carried laughter again, and the rooms vibrated with warmth rather than suspicion. My healing process included acts of service inspired by my father. I returned to the library where he had volunteered, taking on responsibilities he had once held. Organizing programs for children, assisting with book donations, and reading aloud during storytelling hours reminded me that legacy is lived through action. I also contributed to scholarships he had supported, helping students pursue education and opportunity. Each act, no matter how small, reinforced my sense of purpose and my connection to him. Even as life returned to normalcy, I acknowledged the lingering tension that betrayal leaves. There were moments when Helen's presence, or the memory of her manipulations, flashed in my mind. I had to consciously let go of resentment, understanding that forgiveness, in this context, wasn't about her. It was about freeing myself. Holding on to anger would only tether me to a past I no longer wished to inhabit. I replaced thoughts of vengeance with reflection, imagining alternative paths for her life and mine. This mental exercise didn't excuse her actions. It preserved my dignity. My father's lessons guided me throughout this period. Strength is quiet, he had always said. Integrity does not demand applause. Courage is measured and love persists beyond loss. Each day I practiced these lessons in mundane and profound ways. A kind word to a neighbor, patient listening to a friend, careful decision-making in professional matters. Healing, I discovered, is less a destination than a practice, a daily ritual of aligning one's actions with values. As months passed, the house transformed alongside me. The garden flourished, nurtured by patient hands and intention. The kitchen became a hub of sensory delights, the smell of bread baking, the gentle hiss of coffee, the rhythmic chopping of vegetables. The study held the comforting scent of aged paper and ink. Every corner, every object carried memory, not tension. Walking through the rooms, I felt a sense of belonging I had feared lost forever. I began contemplating the future again, imagining possibilities once clouded by grief. Travel, professional growth, even romance, all felt attainable once more. I allowed myself to hope, to dream, and to plan. The fight had taught me resilience, and resilience opens doors where fear once stood. Finally, I found moments of solitude where I could fully integrate these lessons. Sitting by the study window at dusk, watching the golden light fade into twilight, I whispered to my father, "I kept my promise. I protected what mattered. I will continue to honor your life." The warmth in my chest wasn't a ghost or illusion. It was the embodiment of every lesson he had imparted, alive in me, guiding me forward. I also found the courage to reconnect with my own emotions fully. Joy, sadness, anger, gratitude, they flowed freely now, unblocked by fear of betrayal. I laughed openly, cried when necessary, and allowed myself to embrace the totality of life's emotional spectrum. In doing so, I discovered that true healing requires acknowledgement of every feeling, not just the pleasant ones. The final lesson revealed itself in the quiet moments of everyday life. The world continues to move, people continue to act, and life unfolds with or without our control. What matters is how we navigate it, with integrity, patience, and courage. The house, the garden, the library, and even the scholarship fund became living reminders that the choices we make, how we respond to betrayal, loss, and injustice, define us far more than the actions of others ever could. And so, as I sit here now, sharing this story with you, I ask you to consider your own life. How would you respond if someone tried to erase you, rewrite your story, or diminish your place in the world? Would you fight quietly with patience and dignity, or would you allow anger and fear to dictate your actions? The quiet victories, the ones built from integrity, courage, and love, are the ones that endure. They honor the people we cherish, preserve our dignity, and create a life worth living.